The work I create reflects a diverse and interconnected visual history. My research begins with quilts made by enslaved and free African American women during the time of enslavement through the 20th century. My art is informed by the realities of those who stitched and sewed a resolute legacy that has gifted freedom, personhood, and rich visual language to our world. I love working with clay. Clay is egalitarian, but at the same time indifferent. It doesn't matter how skilled you are. You have to work with and respond to it. When I begin making tiles, I have no idea what the resulting quilt will look like. What I'm really doing is exploring the substance of the clay itself, challenging the intrinsic properties of the material. I strive to sustain and honor the many gifts of my personal and collective history, embedded in the visual chronicles of my communal ancestry. I remember in graduate school, I first encountered quilts and some of my research, just looking at, what I wanted to make, what I found interesting, and always thinking about where I come from and who I am, being African American. That's something you think about a lot because you usually are the only one. And that was my experience in graduate school. And I had a wonderful graduate professor, Denise Ward Brown, who stumbled into my studio one day while I was working, and I was making these vessels and, cutting them in half and putting different parts together in different ways. And she came in and asked me a slew of questions that no one had ever asked me before. Why I was doing what I was doing, which was new to me outside of the kind of format in which you can work sequentially when you're working with clay. There's a process you can rely on, and there are things you can explore and discover. But obviously, you're part of that process. So she was really integral in getting me to see how I could find myself in that process. And it led me to take my research in a different direction. Not just thinking about the clay I'm using, the type of clay body or the type of glaze, but what am I bringing to that? How do I understand what choices I'm making? My epistemology, if you will, right? How do you know what you know? And I don't remember the exact moment. I think in life you're supposed to maybe remember these things, but I can't tell you the exact moment I discovered quilts. But before I knew it, I was in it. And it really offered me a way to think about disparate parts coming together to make a whole. And one thing I learned that I didn't know was that on these plantations, enslaved women weren't just making what we know today as African American quilts, which are like polyrhythmic or bright in color and bold in design. They were actually producing a lot of the quilts under the direction of their owner, their oppressor. They had to learn how to articulate the aesthetics of that culture because they brought with them the skills of sewing, weaving, working with fabric. So those things weren't new. They just had to put them in a different direction. So many of the quilts that you would think aren't made by them actually are. So I was really fascinated that they were hidden within those other cultures that were totally different from them. And to me, it resonates because it makes me think about who I am as a 20th century, now 21st century person. How much time has gone by and why is it that I'm able to do the things that I get to do? And I think at the center of that is to have the choice of how I make my quilts, have the choice of how I make my fabric. I have a certain level of autonomy as an artist that I think is pretty fresh to the time in America if we think about our history. Especially also that brings in the fact that I'm a woman and having that ability to be autonomous in choices. Now, they're not choices where I'm a politician or a full-blown activist, but I just think that even in this level, what I'm able to do is what wasn't done before, so I think it's just as meaningful. And I get to have a different audience that I speak to. And I think the quilt give me a wonderfully broad audience, but then also brings it in to a particular audience. I have seen people who have seen them who are quilters, who have seen my pieces, completely understand what I'm doing, even though I'm not using fabric. Thinking about quilts, what I loved was the duality, that they're a domestic function, something you can use to keep warm. It's practical. It has a utilitarian, a direct, kind of obvious utilitarian function. But the other thing that I started to discover in research, which has been contested, and it's a book called Hidden in Plain View, and it was about a woman in a market in South Carolina who told a story about how these quilt patterns function as signals on the Underground Railroad. Well, historians have countered that by saying some of the patterns, as they are sort of established or started to be used by quilters, didn't line up with the time period of what she was talking about. And there's a part of me that's like, dang it, we just want to have one thing that really transcends and kind of has this supernatural something about the power in that visual communication between people who can't read and people who can't freely speak to one another. There would be the monkey's wrench pattern, which would signal to an enslaved person. If that was hung out, it meant get yourself together, get ready. It's time to leave the plantation and escape. And the bear's claw pattern, don't travel in a straight line, which is obviously practical because if there's bloodhounds on your trail, you don't want to travel in a straight line, which also comes back into the way newspapers were used as wall covering in an enslaved home on the plantation. It wasn't put up in a neat, articulated, straightforward pattern, but overlapped because evil is slowed down by the fact that there's no clarity in the way the wall is activated, that space. So it was about another way of protecting. So all that visual signaling was really interesting to me. So I've let it go. It doesn't matter anymore because now I can make my own quilts and make up my own stories. But once I started looking deeper into the quilts, I started thinking about what they're made of. So cotton. So they're made of the very thing these women have to labor over and pick all day. And it leaves the plantation. And when it comes back to them, it's transformed. And that's the same type of process that happens with ceramics. You start with a material that's in the earth, and it goes through this transformation and looks completely different. All these different veins in the earth are mined and combined. And it's the same thing with the cotton. It starts as this vegetation, this plant that grows, but it comes back by way of Sears and Roebuck, I guess, at the time too. And the kind of also split that there is, the quality fabric goes first for the mistress of the plantation and with power, in that oppressor role in relationship to the women who have to follow these orders in terms of making quilts that reflect the culture of the plantation, but they get the scraps, in any way that they can, because they still have to sew clothes for their children and still need to make coverings for themselves. So they're getting what's left over, and that's what I'm really interested in. So from the time the cotton leaves the plantation and comes back, a lot happens in between. And that's what I've really been getting interested in, is the different continents the cotton goes to in order to be processed, and the different aesthetics and the ways in which cotton can accommodate all those different aesthetics. And it's the same thing with clay. When you think about all the people who work with clay, how different a bowl can be from region to region, country to country, how you can automatically know where a pot is from or the signature of a certain potter or artist that's made something. So I'm interested in that space, and I think that that's what I try to bring into my practice. I'm not going to really work with anything but clay. There's a kind of commitment I have to it as a material. But it doesn't mean I don't work with other materials. I very much do. But my primary interest is in clay because of the range of possibilities that it offers. So as I looked at the quilts, and these traditions, these histories, these women, and I leave the plantation, I'm automatically set upon the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, any way you get from continent to continent, that cotton has touched every continent, and so has clay. So they're kind of these never separated at birth, if you will, kind of materials that I guess I'm always reacquainting and trying to get them to have a reunion. I'm interested in how they've affected how we live our lives, how it's affected commerce, what it means for labor, how it enters our homes, how it enters our everyday lives, which both do, and in such different ways, but in both very powerful ways. So cotton has been a sought after commodity after, wool and silk were found to be not up to the task that cotton has, the ability to wick away moisture, to absorb color, to really express an individual when you put clothes on. Clay has the same thing. It has a range in terms of its technology, from the practical of, providing you a way to eat and store food. But even as we look today, one reason that NASA is able to bring a space shuttle back into space is because they're using a type of porcelain and silica sand that can withstand the heat and the temperature in the atmosphere as the astronauts return. So I think this is two incredible materials to work between that I think in a lifetime, I'll probably only get 10% in, maybe, if I'm lucky. So I decided when I lived in South Carolina, having done so much research as a New Englander about the South, I was now living in the South. And it was an adjustment. It is very much a different culture than what I grew up in. New England does happen to be home of a lot of abolitionists and kind of prides itself of a different history in relation to enslavement in America, but they were just as culpable in some ways. It was just hidden. And it was hidden in that economy that I'm interested in. Wall Street, the wealth of the country was built on that labor that was never compensated. That forced enslaved labor is why Wall Street is able to maintain the wealth that it has. No other material, and I've researched this, has impacted the world in commerce as cotton has. So I decided to grow cotton in the South. It wasn't really a aha moment. I just thought, I have my garden. I guess I'll just grow some cotton and see what that's like. I had no idea what I was doing, so I was able to order the seeds and I planted them and they grew. And I did it for the next 3 years. And everyone asked me when I planted the cotton, what was I going to do with it? And I said, I don't know. I said, isn't it enough just to watch it grow and then not be forced to pick it? And so what I do is I always cut it. I don't pick it. And I just kept it. I thought it was one of the most beautiful plants I had seen, that didn't necessarily end as a flower. And it starts as a flower, and I had no idea. This material I wore all the time and read about, I was just now getting to learn this late in the game. So again, like clay, the transformation in a cotton plant is pretty incredible. It starts out as this delicate flower that you think once it's gone, that's it. But it eventually grows into this kind of hard, round bulb. And it's like that for a really long time. And so then that brings me back to the thinking about when the cotton is gone from the plantation. So something's happening inside, and that's just like the kiln. I can't get in the kiln with the work and see what's happening, but I did eventually drop one of those bulbs and it cracked open and I looked inside and I could see the fibers beginning to form in there. And I knew I had stopped the process because I opened it. And it could be the same thing with a kiln. If I open it, I'm intersecting in something I have no business being in. And I think that that's what's fascinating with these materials. Clay puts up a boundary, and cotton does the same thing when it's growing. So those are kinds of the things I'm thinking about philosophically with the materials, and even in a spiritual sense, thinking about what my limitations are, how I got here. That question goes deeper than just me as an African American woman. You know, that's a question everyone has, you know, being a human being, you know, and I don't know what the answer is to why I make what I make. And I don't know that the point is to find the answer, but it's to produce the work that I do think relates to the things that make me who I am, and also help me see what's similar in others, different, and not that the differences are bad, but that the differences eventually might come and coalesce around cotton, will coalesce around the clay. And again, like I've described as clay is open to everyone. You know, and I think that's what draws me to it. And it's the same thing. We all have to wear clothing as well. And a majority of it is cotton. It's durable, reliable, has a range of visual possibilities. So between clay and cotton, it's their intrinsic qualities that are visible and invisible that I'm in search of. My peers are my friends, and we motivate each other, we inspire each other. And I think the people I choose to have around me, we are the same in that we want art to have validation and to be important. So I don't know that I focus on how different I can look. It's about having the community around you that supports what you do. That gives you the opportunity to talk about these ideas that seem to be so counterculture most of the time. I think that's what I'm more concerned about than anything looking different. I think it's a moot point. It'll look different unless I'm trying to not make it look different. I think the diversity in ceramics can be natural. Now, the opposite can be totally true. People can work within a tradition and within a format, and those works are very similar to each other. And I draw from both, and I don't necessarily have allegiance to any of them. I know there's in clay, there's always rules, and I tend to try to push those rules. And I think that maybe what makes it different is my time as a technician out of graduate school. And I was a studio manager at a place called Wesleyan Potters. And it was a cooperative of ceramics, weaving, and jewelry making. And so people come in to take their, clay class 1 day a week. They get 2.5 hours to work, and they want to make what they recognize as, pottery. And then that's great. And I taught those classes, and that's a wonderful experience to share with people, to teach them how to work on the wheel or hand build, and to see them see the transformation they go through over the, 8 or 10 weeks that they're in the class. And then there were also what there were called key members, people who were really running the cooperative. And they would come to me and want a lot of technical issues solved. I was in charge of firing the kiln and mixing the glazes or introducing new things and helping them try new things. So for all the things they didn't like, I started keeping track of that and figuring out how I could make them things that could be liked, that could be visually valid, that could become something that would make my work different. Because I think artists want that. They don't want their work to look the same. You want it to be different. So I think that's one of the things, the experience as a technician and kind of working with people who do want a preconceived outcome, within terms of how we think about pottery in maybe the more industrialized sense, which does inform a lot of our culture. It does determine the aesthetic by some of the major manufacturers that we have and what would be desired by the majority, in terms of design and marketing and things like that. So I guess to be different would be operating outside of that, which can be a nerve-wracking place. Because when you do that, when you work outside of what might be the majority of approval, you're now doing something unsolicited. and you don't know if people are always ready to see something that you're envisioning, and I think that might be one of the important reasons for me why I decided to continue in education, so that I could give an account of what I'm doing. I think that that's the case for everything, and why not for art? I don't necessarily subscribe to the wholly subjective, well, it's my eye, so I'll behold it however I want, and there you go. I don't necessarily co-sign that wholeheartedly. I know that it has its function as you're working. That's what part of innovation and invention is about. I think that the beholder kind of notion and subjectivity is in the process. You really embrace that and apply it in the process of making work. But in the end, if you want to communicate with other people, you have to have for yourself some objectivity to it. A point of departure, something where, like if you get in a boat, you need a map. And you got to know where you're going. And you want to know why you're going there. Because what if people don't want you there once you get there? So I think that's how I manage that idea of reconciling being an artist and it not fitting into something like a business job. But that's not true, because hedge fund managers don't have to explain to anybody what they're doing. They're speculating. They're looking at different companies, anticipating, taking some risks, inventing things that can cause the whole economy to come down. But and when I do that, that's not happening. It just means I've put an extra object into the world, and it could possibly go in a museum, or it could possibly go in the garbage at some point. My role is really to prepare them to see something new. And that's part of the experience of 4 years in higher education, is to be transformed. And what better class and material to really support that than clay? So I really do work in such a way to set goals and give them things to focus on in the process, so they can be free from feeling that they're like in a predetermined, I have to make it look like this, which can be very difficult, because you do have this rich, beautiful tradition in ceramics, of pottery and the vessel, so it's really hard to balance that, to get them to not fall into, I guess you could say, the status quo. And that's something that in teaching that comes up a lot, and what I talked about with the subjectivity. When I talk to people's work, I talk to my colleagues or my peers, I don't come in and go, I really like this one. I save that for last. What I first come in and tell them is what I see happening. I just tell them the facts. What I see happening visually, what it makes me think of, where I think things are not working together because they make my eyes not focus. I really try to give them a cold read, Then I'll go around and tell them what I like. Because if I'm coming in to talk to someone else about their work, it's not about me. So my preference should wait until the very end. And that's something I try to infuse into my teaching with students, that, this learning experience, yes, is for you, but the reason you're in the classroom with other people is because it's about all of you. And you need the perspective of everybody. And you introducing your own preferences of what you like based on the past isn't helpful. Because into the curriculum, I'm introducing other artists who have done this longer, who have made discoveries, inventions, and statements, etc., that you can benefit from, that will either challenge you or help you see, oh, I'm on the right track with what I'm thinking about with this. Because in art, there's different themes, different ways of working that you first want to identify that you really fit into. So you can see who your heroes are, who you can look to for that kind of encouragement, even people who aren't living anymore. Their work is still here and what they put into it. So I think that the way I research is the way I can approach creating assignments for them so that they can find their own way in establishing themselves creatively, or taking the challenges that that's inherent in the material of clay, talking to marketing students, about, well, you got to convince the clay, don't you? So what do you have to remember in working with it? And it takes the burden off of them feeling that they're not good at it because maybe they're not making something as good as one of the students, one of the art majors. So how do I sort of see who that student is and try to get out of the clay what's going to help them see what their strengths are? Then I'll say that's creativity. It's not only in the object you get in the end, but it's about how you think, and how your thinking starts to differentiate you, how your thinking starts to help you solve something that's a problem, that you don't give up, and that you see, there could be more than one way to get there. So, I'm kind of at the top of the mountain telling them, don't go that way. That is my job. I have to tell them. And sometimes they go that way. And I'm glad that the clay is my co-conspirator, because the clay will blab like page 6 when you didn't slip and score correctly, because later the clay will separate because the clay shrinks, So there are some things that are not negotiable that I don't have to teach all the time. The clay teaches that. So I think those kinds of things apply. You can't jump off a bridge or a building or a cliff and build wings on the way down. And clay is the same way. Once it's at a certain stage, there are things you can no longer do. But there's this beautiful thing called epoxy, so you can glue it on later. You can challenge gravity. You can connect clay pieces at different points. You just have to strategize. You also have to know if it's going to be worth your time and whether it's going to work. So I do think clay has a wonderful way of exposing transferable skills within the liberal arts setting. Why, I think everyone should take a clay class. When I started out, I didn't go to art school right away. Growing up, and I've heard other people say this, you think dead white men were the artists, dead European men. You don't see a lot of women as artists per se. And I knew about the Harlem Renaissance, but that ended. And I knew of people who did creative things, but I just thought that you got a memo or something that was what you were going to do. So I decided, even though I had taken ceramics in high school and knew I really loved it, and there was something I loved about being creative, and having been a dancer, most people don't know that. My body changed, hence why I'm not a dancer. But I knew who Rachmaninoff was when I was 9 years old, and danced Nutcracker, Swan Lake, had been in, had done ballet and modern dance, knew who Martha Graham was. So I always knew I had a physicality. I ran track as well. And there was something about using my body, and being creative. But I thought when you went to college, you need to do something real, So I thought, well, maybe I could do journalism. And I took French, and I went to France. With my French class in high school. I got to spend 3 weeks in France and lived with a family. And I said, well, maybe I'll keep taking French and I can do translation work at the UN. Well, it's a good thing I didn't pursue the journalism, because I guess now you can just post anything on the internet and say it's news. And once I realized I wasn't happy without art, my parents, who were wonderfully supportive, I called my mother crying on the phone my freshman year of college and told her I just wasn't happy. And she was at work. I was in the cafeteria at a payphone. And she says, when you do your art, are you happy? I said, yes. She said, well, listen, we're only doing this once. You're paying for half college. We're paying for the other half. If you want to go to school again for something else, your father and I aren't paying for it. I said, okay. She said, so you need to find somewhere to transfer. I said, okay. She said, we good? I said, yeah. She said, okay, I'll call you later, because she was at work. So I transferred, wound up moving back home. I was at Seton Hall University in New Jersey, moved back home to Hartford Art School, which is one of the oldest art schools in the country. Well, in the country, 125 years old. founded by Mark Twain's wife and Harriet Beecher Stowe and some other prominent women in Hartford, Connecticut, and did ceramics. And then I took a year off, went to graduate school, and kept doing it, So I think those choices are a response to what's going on now. What's going on now is saying only these people can do this. You don't belong here. So I don't know that it's only in my artwork that I'm doing that, but it's in the choices I've made and being able to sustain that presence. I speak up in meetings. I do a lot of things people don't see, and I'll be honest, I'm not a crowd person, so you won't see me at a protest outside, and it's just contrary to how I do things. But I think speaking up at meetings, asking for things, have been the ways I've always been addressing it, and I don't know that it's necessarily my job and my work to address that, even though my work has to do with that. But it has to do with, I think it's about understanding how to contextualize and extract and apply, and to recognize, all human beings are flawed as well. Frederick Douglass was not complimentary to Sojourner Truth. He thought she was unsophisticated and rough around the edges. Dutch was her first language, not English. And she had to learn it when she was sold from her Dutch family. They lost all their wealth, and her mother had no choice. She had to be separated from her mother, and she was purchased by an English family. Nobody taught her English. She was repeatedly beaten because she couldn't understand what she was being asked to do because she spoke Dutch, not English. So what Frederick Douglass saw was someone who didn't have a very good or polished command of the English language, but her legacy is that she was a wonderful orator and went on lecture tours. I was born in a Dutch trading post. Even though it's called New England, it was first established and colonized by the Dutch. So now I see beyond just our shared, ancestry as African Americans, we share this kind of Dutch connection, which the Dutch East India Trading Company was trading cotton and spices. And so it comes back to the cotton as well, and that's about economics. So if I'm talking about those things, I'm gonna just, by way of that, touch upon issues of economic inequality, and just thinking about Sojourner Truth beyond the kind of Black History Month, here's her picture, and then we'll move on. I think I've just been doing it consistently. So I wouldn't say that my work is doing that now. And I don't even know if it's fair that because I am an African American woman that I would even have to do that, Even just saying things like Susan B. Anthony left Sojourner Truth in the dust. She wasn't necessarily included in the conversation Susan B. Anthony was having with her immediate peers, She got on a coin. Sojourner Truth should be on a coin. But Sojourner Truth is in my work. My title works after her. Not because I'm just plastering her face on there, but the way I'm titling it brings people back to a time when she was younger that most people don't know about. I posted a piece on social media, and someone from the Pottery reached out to me and said, well, I never knew Isabella Baumfree was her original name. And she said, you're never too old to learn something. And went and bought the narrative, one of the narratives, I think Mary Washington's narrative of Sojourner Truth. So I got somebody to buy a book. If that's it, I mean, if someone's expecting me to do something in terms of social justice, who's mandating me to do that? You know what I mean? And that's interesting in, sort of who controls how active you are or aren't, and challenging what that means. Is there only one way to do that? No, you can hand build a bowl, you can wheel throw a bowl, One's going to be larger, one's going to be smaller, but they'll serve their purpose. So I think in all this noise of diversity too, to not lose the baby with the bathwater, let's really understand the diversity in everyone's function. If you woke up without your pinky toe, you'd be a little off balance, So I don't know how to say it does that or doesn't do that. I know there's a phrase, if you see someone doing something wrong, say something. No, I say something. Everyone pays attention when a plane crashes. And I think we know that part of the history. We know it in this general way. And I think it's exhausting in the ways that we know it. I think there aren't enough ways in terms of describing the complexity of it and the actual length of it, And I wish they knew some of the powerful stories that actually affected me and others, who are, within that ancestry, that when you have despair, you still do have hope. And I know that sounds cliche, but if they stayed in despair and believed the lies that were told to them, I wouldn't necessarily be sitting here with the evidence of this life I've been able to create for myself, with the autonomy I spoke about earlier in this interview. What it means even to be here in this country, and the history in which people were not allowed to read, weren't considered full 100% human being, defied that by using the very words that were written. These truths are self-evident, all men are created equal. They figured out how to read. And that's called being able to see the truth, that was surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. They were able to penetrate that. And so I think in some ways, looking for the truth is what you want people to find, not whether it's accusing you or putting you in that scenario, but that truth eventually could be at your doorstep one day. And will you be able to identify that, in relationships that you have, in work environments that you have? It's insidious what that history of enslavement created. There are things we're enslaved to of our own choosing in some ways. So how do you take that, as much as the American Revolution is my history, and I was born on the centennial year, 1976, how do you take that history and benefit from it? Do I agree with every single thing the founding fathers said? No. Benjamin Franklin hung out in brothels. But he also flew a kite and discovered something about lightning and electricity, So I think it's about these sort of hidden and invisible instances that I'm looking for in the history, that it's not just kind of a flattened out, there was enslavement and now there isn't. Okay, there's a lot more to find within it that could probably help us solve a lot of problems that we even have today, So I think it's about getting into some of the details of the history and not only seeing the despair, and also for me to not feel that I always have to be sharing the despair or performing the despair. I think my work, sometimes I do think it can look sad depending on the color choices I make, but I'm not trying to evoke a sadness, maybe somber or maybe seriousness is it, but there's also some joy in it, and I think the joy is inherent in what comes together, the way I title the pieces, than even when people meet me, I am separate from my work, but I am the work at the same time in a different way. And I think it is able to communicate something I can't say with words all the time. And then it brings together things that are just about me. I love my garden, so I put my garden in my work. I love color theory. I pretend to be painter inside. And that's why I approach glazes the way I approach glazes, not necessarily as a clay person, but because I look at a lot of paintings. And again, I'm saying, how can I make my glaze look like paint? I don't know why I'm always doing that, but it's what I do. So I think it's about peeling away the layers of the history is what I think is important, and how individuals approach it. To be in it, but not feel you're automatically a part of it, but that you can become a part of it, and how you transform it, what you take away from it, and then how you strain that, to others. But I think in this new format of quilts that I'm making, I'm calling them timeline quilts. And I'm trying to think about how quickly did it take to get cotton somewhere before than it does today? And what does it mean when we price a piece of clothing with cotton? I grew cotton and paid $5 for the packet of seeds, but then people are being almost slave labor somewhere in Bangladesh producing clothing. That's like been happening. So I'm interested in how time has progressed, but then there are still things that are the same for people in different places, and thinking about that.